The truck's engine died with a shudder that seemed to shake the silence itself. Garrett Ashford sat behind the wheel for a moment longer than necessary, hands still gripping at 10 and 2 knuckles white against the cracked leather. Through the dusty windshield, 50 acres of Oregon wilderness stretched out before him, all of it his now bought with the last of his savings in the bitter certainty that this was as far as he could run. 43 years old, Navy SEAL for 15 of them. And now at the end of everything, owner of land nobody else wanted. The gray blue of his eyes caught the late afternoon sun as he finally stepped out. 6'1", lean in the way of men who'd forgotten how to rest, he stood there in his olive field jacket, the one with the worn patches at the elbows, and let the mountain air fill his lungs. It smelled of pine and coming rain, and nothing that reminded him of sand or heat or the sound of rotors cutting through desert sky. Behind him, the passenger door opened with a metallic groan. Kodiak emerged in a single fluid motion, all 70 pounds of disciplined muscle and controlled alertness. The German Shepherd's black and tan coat gleamed in the fading light, his ears upright, his stance precise. 7 years old, military canine retired. The only member of Garrett's last unit who'd made it home without a flag on the coffin. Home, Garrett said, though the word felt like a lie in his mouth. The dog's eyes, dark, intelligent, calculating, swept across the landscape with the systematic thoroughness of a soldier clearing a room. Not a pet, never a pet, a partner who'd saved Garrett's life twice and had the shrapnel scars to prove it. Together they stood at the edge of what Garrett hoped might be peace, or at least silence loud enough to drown out the screaming in his head. The mountains of the Cascade Range rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with early autumn snow. Below, the forest grew thick and untouched, the kind of wild that had swallowed logging towns and mining camps, and the dreams of men who'd thought they could tame it. Garrett pulled the road map from his jacket pocket. According to the survey, his 50 acres cut a rough rectangle through what the realtor had called challenging terrain. Translation: worthless. Too steep for building, too remote for development, too stubborn for anything but trees and silence. Perfect. He'd paid cash. Signed the papers without reading them, shook the realtor's hand, and left before the man could ask the questions that hung in his eyes. Why here? Why alone? Why does a man who looks like he's running by land at the end of the earth? The answers weren't ones Garrett knew how to speak. Kodiak moved ahead with the economy of motion that marked all his actions, nose low, working the scent picture that humans couldn't begin to comprehend. Every few yards, the dog would pause, process, file the information away in whatever mental catalog governed a canine's world. They'd been a team for 6 years. Garrett knew the dog's body language better than he knew his own face in the mirror. The angle of Kodiak's ears, the tension in his shoulders, the way his tail remained low and still when working, saving every ounce of energy for the task at hand. Let's see what we bought, Garrett said. The dog glanced back, a single flick of acknowledgement, then continued his systematic sweep of the perimeter. The sun dropped lower. Shadows stretched long across the uneven ground, turning the forest into a cathedral of green darkness and slanting gold light. Somewhere in the distance, a creek ran over stones. Closer, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Garrett had learned to find God in silence. Had learned it in the spaces between gunfire and the held breath before a breach, in the terrible quiet after someone stopped screaming. The chaplain back at base had called it prayer. Garrett called it survival. Either way, the silence here felt different. Clean, maybe. Unmarked by the kind of things that left stains on a man's soul. They walked for 20 minutes, following no path but the natural breaks in the undergrowth. Kodiak led as he always did, and Garrett followed, trusting the dog's instincts more than his own GPS. That's when it happened. Kodiak stopped. Not the casual pause of a boy investigating an interesting scent, but the kind of sudden, complete stillness that made Garrett's hand instinctively drop to where his sidearm used to ride. The German Shepherd's ears snapped forward, locked on something ahead. His body went rigid, not with aggression, but with the trained alertness of a military dog signaling contact. What is it, boy? The dog didn't move, didn't so much as twitch. In 6 years of working together, Garrett had learned that when Kodiak froze like this, there was a reason. Always a reason. Garrett moved up beside him, scanning the forest ahead. Trees, undergrowth. The slope of the land dropping away toward what looked like a natural ravine. Nothing unusual, except Kodiak hadn't moved. His nose pointed like a compass towards something Garrett couldn't see, couldn't smell, couldn't sense with his limited human awareness. Show me. The command came out, automatic muscle memory from 100 missions. But Kodiak didn't advance. Instead, the dog shifted his weight, a subtle movement that Garrett recognized immediately. Refusal. Not disobedience, never that. Kodiak was too disciplined, too professional for simple defiance. This was assessment. The dog had detected something and concluded that forward movement was inadvisable. Garrett felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old combat reflex kicking in. Trust your partner. Trust the dog. How many times had that instinct saved his life? Stay, he said quietly. Kodiak settled into a seated position, alert but not aggressive, watching as Garrett moved past him into the trees. The ground sloped downward more steeply than it appeared, and Garrett had to catch himself against a pine trunk to keep from sliding. The forest here grew denser, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the remaining daylight. That clean mountain air took on a different quality, damper, older, carrying the scent of rot and rust. And then he saw it. At first, his brain couldn't make sense of what his eyes were showing him. The shape didn't belong, couldn't belong. Not here, not 40 miles from the nearest railroad, not half buried in 40 years of forest growth and geological patience. A railcar, a freight car to be specific. Rust red, its paint long since surrendered to oxidation and weather. 40 feet long, maybe 8 feet wide, sitting at an impossible angle in a natural depression, as if the earth had tried to swallow it and given up halfway through. Vines covered it like arterial veins. Moss grew thick on the northern side. A young fir tree, maybe 15 feet tall, had sprouted from the roof, its roots working down through seams that had surrendered to time and moisture. Garrett stood there trying to reconcile the impossible with the real. There were no tracks, no cleared path that might indicate how it got here. No roads wide enough or graded enough to haul something this size. The nearest active railway was the Union Pacific line that ran through the valley 40 miles west, carrying timber and grain to the coast. This car hadn't rolled here. Couldn't have. The physics made no sense. But there it was, undeniable as bone. He circled it slowly, combat training, taking over, assessing threat level and tactical options without conscious thought. The car listed to one side, its undercarriage half buried in accumulated soil and deadfall. The wheels, massive things, solid steel, were barely visible beneath decades of forest floor buildup. On the side, barely legible beneath rust and lichen, he could make out a serial number, SP 471839, Southern Pacific. And below that, stenciled in faded white paint, property of Valchem Industries. The name meant nothing to him. Garrett approached the side door, a heavy sliding panel designed to move on tracks that had long since seized with corrosion. He put his shoulder against it, testing. The metal groaned but didn't budge. Years of rust had welded it shut more effectively than any lock. Around the back, he found what he was looking for, a smaller access door intended for workers or inspectors. The padlock that had once secured it hung open, its hasp rusted through and useless. The door opened with a shriek of metal that sent birds scattering from nearby trees. Inside, darkness. Garrett pulled the small flashlight from his jacket pocket, another habit from the team's always carry light, and swept the beam through the interior. The railcar had been converted into something between an office and a storage facility. Metal shelving units lined both walls, most of them collapsed or tilting at dangerous angles. Filing cabinets, their drawers hanging open like slack mouths, disgorging yellowed paper onto the floor. A desk overturned, a chair on its side. And everywhere the evidence of abandonment, mouse nests in the corners, water damage blooming across documents, the slow, patient work of decay. But it was what covered the walls that made Garrett step fully inside. Maps, dozens of them pinned and taped to every available surface. Topographical maps of the region, marked with colored pins and hand-drawn annotations. Satellite imagery from an era when such things were still printed on paper. And written across several of them in red marker, the same phrase repeated like a warning or a prophecy. Contamination zone. Do not develop. Garrett moved deeper into the car, flashlight beam cutting through the dusty air. The filing cabinets yielded folders thick with documents, soil samples, water quality reports, chemical analysis data, all dated between 1985 and 1986. All stamped with the Valchem Industries logo, a stylized V wrapped around a chemical formula he didn't recognize. On the desk beneath a layer of dust that suggested decades rather than years, he found a leather-bound journal. The cover cracked when he opened it, dried and brittle. Inside, handwriting in blue ink, still legible despite the year's field notes. Dr. Catherine Brennan, environmental consultant. Garrett flipped through pages filled with observations, measurements, coordinates. The handwriting grew more urgent as he progressed the letters, pressing harder into the page, the organization deteriorating into something more frantic. Near the end, an entry dated December 12, 1986. They're lying. The soil samples don't lie, the water table doesn't lie, but they're calling me paranoid. Valchem dumped here for years, industrial solvents, heavy metals, compounds I can't even identify without better equipment. This whole valley should be condemned. Instead, they're planning residential development. They're going to build houses here, schools, and they're going to get people killed slowly, invisibly across decades. I've documented everything. If something happens to me, this car contains the truth. But who will find it? Who will believe the next page was blank? And the next? Until the final entry written in a hand that shook so badly the words barely formed. If you're reading this, they've already won. But at least now you know I wasn't crazy. KB. Garrett stood in the rusted rail car in the middle of his worthless 50 acres holding evidence of something that shouldn't exist and didn't make sense. Outside, Kodiak let out a single soft bark, not aggressive, but questioning. The dog had remained at his post exactly where Garrett had left him, but patience had its limits, even for a trained canine. "I'm coming," Garrett called. But before he left, he pulled his phone from his pocket and took photographs. The maps, the documents, the journal pages, the chemical reports with their incomprehensible formulas and damning conclusions. The light was almost gone when he emerged. The forest had shifted into that peculiar twilight that belonged neither to day nor night, when the world existed in shades of gray, and the mind could almost believe in things that logic said were impossible. Kodiak stood exactly where Garrett had left him, but the dog's posture had changed. His ears were back slightly, his weight distributed differently. If Garrett had to translate that body language into human terms, it would come out something like, "I told you something was wrong." "Yeah," Garrett said quietly. "You did." They made their way back to the truck in silence. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and Garrett's breath began to show in small clouds. Above the first stars appeared in a sky so clear, it seemed impossible that anything on Earth could be complicated or corrupt. But Garrett knew better. He'd spent 15 years learning that the world was full of things buried and hidden secrets that stayed secret only as long as nobody looked too hard or cared too much. The question now was what to do about it. Pine Ridge sat at the junction of two county roads that probably shouldn't have qualified as roads at all, paved once in the 1970s and left to crack and heave through decades of freeze and thaw. Population 1,847, according to the sign. Population 1,200, according to Garrett's guess, based on the number of businesses with closed signs in the windows and houses with that particular emptiness that meant nobody had lived there in years. It was the kind of town that logging had built and globalization had gutted. The kind of place where the young left as soon as they could and the old stayed because moving required resources or hope, and most folks ran short on both. Garrett pulled the truck into the gravel lot of a diner that advertised home-style cooking and opened daily in neon that flickered like a dying heartbeat. The parking lot held three other vehicles, a sheriff's department cruiser, a pickup truck held together by rust and determination, and a sedan that had seen better decades. Kodiak lifted his head from the passenger seat, assessing. "Wait here," Garrett said, cracking the windows. "I'll bring you something." The dog settled back with the patient stillness of a professional who understood operational necessities. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and frying grease, and the particular comfort of places where the menu hasn't changed in 30 years. Red vinyl booths lined the windows. A counter with chrome-edged stools ran the length of the room. In the back, through a service window, Garrett could see the kitchen where someone moved with the efficient rhythm of long practice. Three people occupied the space. The sheriff, a man in his late 50s with the solid build of someone who'd been athletic once and hadn't quite given up, sat at the counter nursing coffee and reading something on a tablet. In a corner booth, an elderly man worked through a plate of meatloaf with the slow deliberation of someone eating alone. And behind the counter, refilling the sheriff's cup with the automatic grace of 10,000 repetitions, stood a woman who looked to be somewhere in her 50s. She had the kind of face that suggested she'd been beautiful once and had aged into something better, character written in the lines around her eyes, competence in the set of her shoulders. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore a name tag that read Lorelei. "A coffee?" she asked as Garrett slid onto a stool. "Please." She poured without spilling a drop and without looking, the kind of muscle memory that comes from doing a thing so many times it becomes part of your body's knowledge. "Menus on the board," she said, nodding toward a chalkboard above the kitchen window. "Daily specials, the meatloaf. It's good." "I'll take it," Garrett said. "And another order to go if that's all right." "For your friend in the truck." Garrett paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. "You saw him?" Lorelei smiled, and it reached her eyes in a way that suggested genuine warmth rather than small-town nosiness. "German Shepherd, military vest, windows cracked exactly 3 inches. Man who takes care of a dog like that isn't having dinner alone by choice." The sheriff glanced over, interested now. "You military?" "Was Beckham," Garrett said. "Which branch?" Navy. Something shifted in the sheriff's expression. Recognition maybe, or respect. SEAL. Garrett nodded once. The sheriff extended a hand. Tom Ridgway, sheriff here for 23 years. Thank you for your service. They shook and Garrett caught the assessment happening behind the older man's eyes. Cops and soldiers learn to read people the same way, quick, comprehensive, looking for threat or weakness or the things that didn't quite add up. Garrett Ashford. Well, you passing through or putting down roots? Bought some land up the mountain, 50 acres off Route 7. Ridgway's eyebrows rose slightly. The old Whitaker property, nobody's touched that land in 40 years. Exactly why I bought it. Lorelei returned with a plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans that steamed in the cool air of the diner. She set it down with practiced efficiency, along with silverware wrapped in a paper napkin. You want gravy on the to-go order? She asked. No gravy, just meat and vegetables. No seasoning, if you can avoid it. Now it was Lorelei's turn to pause, understanding dawning. That's not for a person, is it? That's for Yurdo. Yes, ma'am. She shook her head, but she was smiling. I'll fix him a proper plate. What's his name? Kodiak. Military working dog. Retired. I bet he's got standards, she said, and disappeared into the kitchen before Garrett could respond. He ate in silence, aware of the sheriff's occasional glances, but grateful the man didn't push conversation. The meatloaf was good, not great, but honest. The kind of food made by someone who'd cooked the same recipe so many times they could do it in their sleep. Through the window, he could see Kodiak's silhouette in the truck, patient and still. Lorelei emerged with a to-go container, but instead of setting it on the counter, she walked to the door. I'm taking this out to him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I'm going to. Garrett watched through the window as Lorelei approached the truck. Kodiak's head lifted immediately, ears forward, assessing. She stopped a respectful distance away, spoke Garrett couldn't hear the words, and set the container on the hood before stepping back. The exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds. When Lorelei returned, she was laughing. That, she said, is the most judgmental dog I've ever met in my life. What happened? I put the food down, told him it was fresh and made special. He sniffed it, looked at it from 3 different angles, and then looked at me like I'd personally insulted his entire ancestry. Despite himself, Garrett smiled. He's particular. He's a food critic with fur. She refilled his coffee without being asked. Military dogs are like that, aren't they? All business. He's saved my life more than once. He's earned the right to have standards. The sheriff stood, dropping a few bills on the counter. Welcome to Pine Ridge, Mr. Ashford. If you need anything, the station's on Main Street. Can't miss it. It's the only building with bars on the windows. Appreciate it. After Ridgway left, the diner fell into comfortable quiet. The old man in the corner finished his meatloaf and departed with a nod. Lorelei wiped down the counter, her movements practiced and economical. So what brings a Navy SEAL to the middle of nowhere? She asked, conversational rather than prying. Garrett considered his answer. Peace and quiet. Well, you picked the right place. We've got plenty of both. She paused, studying him with the kind of directness that suggested she'd raised children and buried a husband and didn't have patience for bullshit. Although if you bought the Whitaker property, you might be in for more than you bargained for. How so? That land's got a history, nothing specific, just stories. People used to say strange things happened up there, equipment breaking down for no reason. Hunters getting turned around even with compasses. Dogs refusing to go into certain areas. Garrett thought of Kodiak's frozen stance, the absolute refusal to approach the railcar. You believe in that? He asked. Lorelei shrugged. I believe that sometimes there are things we don't understand, and smart people pay attention to the warnings. She met his eyes. Your dog warned you about something today, didn't he? There was no point in denying it. Yeah, he did. Then maybe you should listen. Back at the truck, Garrett found Kodiak exactly where he'd left him, the to-go container untouched on the hood. Really, Garrett said, she made that special for you. The dog's expression, if a German shepherd could be said to have expressions, conveyed polite disdain. The food wasn't rejected out of rudeness, but rather professional assessment and found wanting. You're going to offend people, Garrett said, but he retrieved the container and dumped it in the diner's trash. He'd feed Kodiak from his own supplies back at camp, the high-quality kibble the dog had been eating since his military days, mixed with whatever protein Garrett had on hand. They drove back up the mountain in darkness, the truck's headlights cutting tunnels through the forest. Garrett had set up a basic camp that morning, tent, sleeping bag, the portable stove he'd carried through 3 deployments. Rougher than necessary maybe, but Garrett had learned that comfort could become a crutch, and he couldn't afford crutches. He parked near the tent and killed the engine. In the sudden silence, the forest revealed its nighttime symphony owls calling the rustle of things moving through underbrush, the creek's constant murmur. Kodiak jumped down from the kin and immediately began a perimeter check, nose working, moving in the systematic pattern that had been drilled into him through years of training. Garrett started a small fire, unnecessary for warmth, but necessary for something human in him that needed to push back against the darkness. He fed Kodiak, then ate his own rations, a protein bar, and instant coffee that tasted like hot dirt, but had enough caffeine to keep him functional. The tent he'd erected that morning listed slightly to one side the ground, not quite level despite his best efforts. Kodiak sat down approximately 6 feet from the tent, stared at it, and slowly tilted his head in the canine equivalent of profound disappointment. "Don't start," Garrett muttered. The dog's expression didn't change. The tilt of his head said everything that needed saying about the tent's structural integrity, Garrett's competence, and the general decline in standards since leaving active duty. "It's fine." Kodiak's head tilted further now at an angle that suggested the dog was reconsidering his choice of handler. "It'll keep the rain off." One ear dropped slightly, adding a note of skepticism to the existing judgment. Garrett's side walked over and adjusted the tent's guy lines until the structure stood properly vertical. When he turned back, Kodiak had already moved on to more important matters, investigating a scent trail that led toward the creek. But Garrett could swear the dog looked satisfied. He spent the next hour reviewing the photographs he'd taken in the railcar, zooming in on documents, trying to make sense of chemical formulas, and testing protocols that were beyond his expertise. The name Valdchem Industries appeared on nearly every page, along with references to something called Project Clearwater, which, given the content of the documents, struck Garrett as the kind of ironic naming that corporations specialized in. Dr. Catherine Brennan's journal entries grew increasingly frantic as they progressed through late 1986. References to pressure from corporate, threats veiled as concerns, and finally in early December, a single line that made Garrett's chest tighten. "They know I'm not going to stay quiet. I've made arrangements. If something happens to me, the truth will come out." 3 months later, according to a newspaper clipping Garrett found in the journal's back pages, Dr. Brennan had been found dead in her apartment. The coroner ruled it suicide by overdose. The local paper mentioned her history of mental health struggles and paranoid accusations against local employers. Case closed, truth buried, except the railcar existed. The documents existed. The contamination zone marked on those maps existed, and if Garrett's sense of geography was correct, his 50 acres sat right in the middle of Ishtit. Kodiak returned from his patrol and settled near the fire, close enough for warmth, but maintaining the professional distance of a working dog. His eyes reflected the flames, turning them briefly gold before he blinked, and they returned to dark intelligence. "We found something today," Garrett said quietly. "Question is, what do we do about it?" The dog's ears swiveled toward him, attentive but offering no answers. Garrett had spent 15 years of his life learning to follow orders, to trust the chain of command, to believe that the system worked even when evidence suggested otherwise. He'd been good at it. Good enough to make SEAL Team 6. Good enough to lead men into situations where hesitation meant death. And then on an operation in 2019 that he still couldn't talk about, he'd given an order. The wrong order, based on intelligence that turned out to be bad and assumptions that turned out to be fatal. 3 men died because of his call. The Navy cleared him. Fog of war, insufficient information, heat of the moment. All the phrases that meant nobody was technically at fault, but everyone knew someone was. Garrett knew. He'd left 6 months later with an honorable discharge and the kind of commendations that felt like apologies. And he'd spent the 3 years since trying to find a place quiet enough that he couldn't hear the screaming anymore. But now holding evidence of a cover-up that had probably killed people slowly and visibly across decades, he felt the old pull. The sense that silence wasn't neutrality, that looking away was itself a choice. The fire burned down to coals, the temperature dropped into the 40s. Garrett banked the fire, checked the camp one last time, and retreated to his crooked tent. Kodiak took up position at the entrance, settling into the alert rest that meant he was sleeping, but still aware, still on duty, still the professional soldier he'd been trained to be. In the darkness, Garrett lay in his sleeping bag and stared at the tent's ceiling. Somewhere out there, buried under decades of forest growth and deliberate forgetting, was a truth that someone had worked very hard to hide. A truth that had probably cost Dr. Catherine Brennan her life. A truth that if Lorelei's stories were accurate, people in this town had sensed but never named. And now that truth was Garrett's problem on his land, under his responsibility. He thought about his brother, not the one who died in the mission, but the other one. Captain Boone Ashford, 12 years older, the one who joined the Navy first and made it safe for Garrett to follow. Boone had left the service in 2018, supposedly to take a civilian contractor job. They talked maybe twice after that brief awkward conversations about nothing important. Boone died 6 months later. Training accident, they said. Garrett hadn't questioned it, had been too deep in his own guilt and grief to wonder why his brother would be doing training in a civilian role. Now lying in the darkness with evidence of Valdkem's crimes on his phone, Garrett remembered something Lorelei had said, that land's got a history, and something in Dr. Brennan's journal, I've made arrangements. And the question that had been forming all day finally crystallized into something he could name. What if his brother had been one of those arrangements? What if Boone had known? What if that's why he died outside the tent? Kodiak shifted position, a small movement that nevertheless conveyed alertness. The dog sensed something, not threat necessarily, but change. The subtle shift that meant circumstances were evolving in ways that required attention. Garrett closed his eyes but didn't sleep. Tomorrow he decided he'd start looking for answers. Tomorrow he'd stop running. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of October dawn that turned breath to vapor and made every sound carry twice as far. Garrett woke to find Kodiak already alert, sitting at attention outside the tent, watching the forest with the patient focus of a sentry who'd held position all night. "You sleep at all?" Garrett asked. The dog's ear twitched acknowledgement without commitment. They ate breakfast in silence, with Kodiak working through his high-grade kibble with methodical efficiency, Garrett forcing down instant oatmeal that tasted like cardboard paste. The fire from last night had died to ash, but Garrett didn't rebuild it. The morning sun would warm things soon enough, and he had work to do. The Pine Ridge Public Library occupied a brick building on Main Street that looked like it had been optimistic in 1952 and defeated ever since. Garrett pushed through the glass doors at 9 a.m., Kodiak waiting in the truck with windows cracked and a bowl of water. Inside smelled of old paper and lemon cleaning solution. The librarian, a thin woman in her 70s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked up from her desk with the surprised expression of someone not used to visitors before noon. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for old newspaper archives," Garrett said, "specifically anything from 1986 to 1988. Her expression shifted to something more engaged. "Local papers or broader?" "Start local. The Pine Ridge Gazette, if that's what it was called. Still is, though it's down to weekly publication now." She stood, gesturing for him to follow. "We've got bound volumes in the basement. Not digitized, I'm afraid. Budget cuts." The basement was exactly what Garrett expected: concrete floors, metal shelving units, the smell of mildew fighting a losing battle against dehumidifiers. The bound newspaper volumes sat in chronological order, each one representing a year of small-town life reduced to yellowing newsprint. "Anything specific you're looking for?" the librarian asked. "Dr. Catherine Brennan." The woman's face went carefully neutral, not blank but deliberately empty, in the way that meant she recognized the name and had opinions about it. "The environmental scientist," she said finally. "You knew her, knew of her." "I was newer to town back then, but everyone talked about it when she died." A pause. "Such a shame. Brilliant woman from what I heard, but troubled." "Troubled how?" The librarian chose her words with care. "She made accusations about Valdkem Industries, said they were contaminating the water table, poisoning the land, created quite a stir for a few months." Another pause. "Then she died, and people said it proved she'd been unstable all along." "What do you think?" The question seemed to surprise her. She looked at Garrett more directly, assessing. "I think that sometimes the people who see clearly are the ones who get called crazy. And I think asking too many questions in a company town is dangerous." She pointed to the shelf. 1987 is third from the left. You'll find what you're looking for in March." She left him alone with 40 years of bound newspapers. Garrett found the obituary on March 15, 1987. Brief, almost dismissive, Dr. Catherine Brennan, 42, environmental consultant, found deceased in her apartment. Authorities ruled the death a suicide by prescription drug overdose. Dr. Brennan had recently made controversial claims regarding industrial practices in the region. She is survived by a sister in California. Memorial services pending. No mention of her credentials, no acknowledgement of her work, just the subtle character assassination of controversial claims and the implicit suggestion that her death somehow validated dismissing her concerns. 3 weeks earlier, on February 23rd, a longer article, "Environmental Claims Against Valdkem Dismissed. Independent Review Finds No Evidence of Contamination." Garrett read it twice. The independent review had been conducted by Harrison Environmental Services, a firm based in Seattle. The review concluded that Dr. Brennan's soil and water samples were improperly collected and analyzed, that her methodology was questionable at best, and that there was no credible evidence of industrial contamination in the Pine Ridge watershed. The article quoted Valdchem's spokesman extensively. We take environmental concerns seriously, but we cannot allow baseless accusations to damage our reputation or the economic foundation of this community, Dr. Brennan's claims have been thoroughly investigated and found to be without merit. At the bottom of the article, almost an afterthought, Dr. Brennan could not be reached for comment because Garrett thought they had already started destroying her credibility, already started the whisper campaign that would make her death 3 weeks later seem inevitable rather than suspicious. He kept reading. April 1987, Valdchem announces expansion. 50 new jobs coming to Pine Ridge. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The town that might have questioned a convenient death was too busy celebrating economic opportunity. May 1987, new residential development planned. Clearwater Estates to bring growth to Pine Ridge. The development was slated for land just south of town in an area that, according to Dr. Brennan's maps, sat directly over the contamination zone. Garrett pulled out his phone and cross-referenced the coordinates. His 50 acres bordered the proposed development site. The Whitaker property that nobody had touched in 40 years sat right at the edge of where Valdchem had planned to build houses and schools and parks on poison ground. Had someone known? Was that why the land stayed empty? He photographed the relevant articles, then moved forward in time. June 1987. Clearwater Estates delayed, permit issues. No details provided. July 1987. Nothing. August 1987. Valdchem closes fabrication plant, 30 jobs lost, blamed on market conditions and regulatory environment. After that, Clearwater Estates disappeared from the paper entirely. The development that would have brought growth to Pine Ridge simply stopped. No explanation, no follow-up articles, just silence where there should have been houses. Garrett climbed back upstairs to find the librarian shelving books. Did you find what you needed, she asked. Found more questions than answers. What happened to Harrison Environmental Services, the firm that did the independent review? She frowned, thinking. I believe they went out of business a few years after that. There was some kind of scandal, falsified reports for industrial clients, made the news briefly. Convenient. Yes, she said quietly. It was, wasn't it? Garrett left the library with a growing sense that he was pulling on a thread that went deeper than he'd imagined. Kodiak lifted his head as Garrett approached the truck, assessing his handler's tension with the precision of 6 years' partnership. We need to find someone who was here in the 80s, Garrett said, someone who remembers. The diner seemed like the obvious choice. Small towns ran on gossip and coffee, and Lorelei struck him as someone who paid attention. The lunch crowd was thin, a few locals at the counter, a family in a booth, the smell of grilled cheese and tomato soup. Lorelei was pouring coffee with the same practiced efficiency as yesterday, but she smiled when Garrett slid onto a stool. Back already. Your dog decided my cooking wasn't that bad after all. He's reconsidering his position. Good, what can I get you? Information, actually. You said you were newer to town in the 80s. Do you know anyone who was here when Dr. Catherine Brennan died? The smile faded. Lorelei set down the coffee pot with deliberate care. Why are you asking about her? I found something on my property, something that suggests she might have been right. For a long moment, Lorelei didn't respond. Then she glanced toward the kitchen and where an older man was working the grill and made a decision. Silas Merrick, he's the one you want to talk to. Used to be a reporter for the Gazette back then. Lives out on County Road 12, the blue house with the white fence. Can't miss it. Thank you. Mr. Ashford. She caught his arm as he stood. Be careful. People who ask questions about Valdchem tend to have bad luck. County Road 12 wound through farmland that had seen better decades past, houses with sagging porches and barns slowly surrendering to gravity. The blue house with the white fence sat back from the road, surrounded by oak trees that dropped leaves like copper coins across an immaculate lawn. Silas Merrick answered the door in carpet slippers and a cardigan, holding a book with his finger marking the page. 68, maybe 70, with white hair, and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested his mind hadn't retired along with his body. Help you. My name's Garrett Ashford. I bought the old Whitaker property up the mountain. Lorelei at the diner said you might be willing to talk to me about Dr. Catherine Brennan. Something flickered in Merrick's expression, surprise maybe, or recognition. He studied Garrett for a long moment, then stepped back from the door. Come in. Leave your boots by the door. The interior was exactly what Garrett expected from a career journalist. Books everywhere, newspapers stacked in careful piles. A desk covered in papers, organized in a system that probably made sense only to Merrick himself. The walls held framed articles, and a journalism degree from Northwestern yellowed with age. Merrick gestured to a chair and settled himself into what was clearly his usual spot, a recliner position for optimal reading light. Dr. Brennan, he said, haven't heard that name in years. What makes you curious about ancient history? I found a railcar on my property. Inside were documents dated 1985 and 1986, environmental reports, soil samples, evidence that Valdchem was dumping industrial waste in the valley. Merrick's face went very still. You found the railcar. You knew about it. I suspected. Catherine Dr. Brennan. She told me she'd hidden the evidence somewhere safe, somewhere they couldn't reach it. But she died before she could tell me where. He leaned forward. What exactly did you find? Garrett pulled out his phone and showed him the photographs. Merrick studied each one with the intensity of a man looking at ghosts made solid. His fingers scrolling slowly, his expression growing darker. Jesus, he whispered. She documented everything. You tried to report this back then. Tried and failed. I was young, idealistic, thought the truth mattered. I wrote 3 articles about her allegations. My editor killed all of them. Said we couldn't publish unsubstantiated accusations against the town's largest employer. Merrick's jaw tightened. 2 weeks later, Catherine was dead. A week after that, my editor got a job offer in Portland. Better pay, better paper. He left, and his replacement made it clear that certain topics were off limits. Valdchem owned the paper. Didn't need to own it. They owned the advertising revenue. The paper survives on local business ads, and Valdchem influences most of those businesses directly or indirectly. Kill their ads, you kill the paper. Simple economics. So you gave up? Merrick's eyes flashed. I got married, had a daughter, received a phone call from a very polite man who knew my daughter's school schedule, my wife's route to work, the exact times we were most vulnerable. He never made a direct threat. Didn't need to. The message was clear. Stop asking questions or people you love will suffer. And you believed him. Catherine Brennan died of a drug overdose despite never having had a prescription for sleeping pills in her life. The autopsy was rushed. The investigation was cursory. And 3 months later, the medical examiner who signed her death certificate bought a house in Scottsdale he couldn't possibly have afforded on his salary. Merrick met Garrett's eyes. Yes, I believed him. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, wind moved through the oak trees, scattering more leaves. Who was the polite man? Garrett asked. I never knew his name, but I saw him around town for years after that. Still do occasionally, though he's older now. Goes by Thaddeus Crow, corporate relations director for Valdchem, public face of the company, fundraiser for local causes, sponsors the Little League. And privately, he's the man who makes problems disappear. Garrett thought about the documents in the railcar, about Dr. Brennan's desperate journal entries about a truth buried for 38 years. I need to know what happened to Clearwater Estates. The development they planned on contaminated land. Merrick stood and moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder thick with clippings. The development stopped because someone leaked information to the state EPA. Anonymous tip that got them to do their own soil testing. They found enough evidence of contamination to halt all development pending further investigation. Who leaked it? Never found out, but the EPA investigation got shut down after 3 months. Some kind of jurisdictional dispute with federal regulators. The contamination report was classified as inconclusive, and the land was quietly rezoned as agricultural, meaning no residential development allowed. But Valdchem never got prosecuted. No, the evidence mysteriously went missing. The EPA inspector who'd led the investigation took early retirement and moved to Florida. And Clearwater Estates became a cautionary tale about overambitious development in economically depressed areas. Merrick handed Garrett the folder. Keep this. I've held on to it for 38 years thinking someday someone would care. Maybe you're that someone. Garrett was halfway to the door when Merrick spoke again. Mr. Ashford, the Whitaker property. You know why nobody bought it all these years. Contaminated land. Partly, but also because strange things happened there. Equipment failures. People getting sick. Dogs refusing to enter certain areas. A pause. Your dog warned you about something, didn't he? The railcar. He wouldn't go near it. Merrick nodded slowly. Animals know. They sense what we've trained ourselves to ignore. If I were you, I'd listen to him. Back at the truck, Garrett found Kodiak alert but calm, watching the road with professional awareness. The dog turned as Garrett approached, ears forward, waiting. We're going to need help, Garrett said. Someone who can analyze those soil samples. Someone who can prove what Valdchem buried. Kodiak's tail moved once, not a wag, but acknowledgement. They were pulling back onto County Road 12 when Garrett's phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. Ashford, Mr. Ashford, this is Thaddeus Crow. I work for Valdchem Industries. I wonder if you might have a few minutes to talk. The voice was smooth, educated, carrying the kind of warmth that professional manipulators cultivated like a garden. Garrett's hand tightened on the wheel. About what? About the property you recently purchased. I think there may be some confusion about its history and potential uses. I'd hate for you to make expensive mistakes based on incomplete information. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Would you be available to meet this afternoon? There's a coffee shop on Main Street. Say 3 o'clock. Garrett checked his watch. 12:30. I'll be there. Excellent. I look forward to meeting you. The line went dead. Kodiak shifted in the passenger seat, sensing the change in Garrett's tension. Yeah, Garrett said quietly. I know, but we need to see what he wants. The coffee shop was called Mountain Brew and occupied a storefront that had probably changed hands a dozen times in 40 years. Exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, the hiss of an espresso machine. 3 customers sat at different tables, laptops, open earbuds in. Thaddeus Crow sat in the corner furthest from the door, positioned so he could see everyone who entered. He stood when Garrett approached, 6 feet tall, early 50s, wearing a tailored suit that looked expensive, without being ostentatious. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced. Mr. Ashford, thank you for coming. Please sit. Can I get you something? I'm fine. Of course. Crow settled back into his chair with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. I'll get straight to the point. We've heard you've been asking questions about old industrial practices in the area, specifically questions related to Dr. Catherine Brennan's allegations from the 1980s. News travels fast. Small town, people talk. A pause. I want to be transparent with you. Valdchem has been part of this community for over 50 years. We employ directly or indirectly nearly 60% of Pine Ridge's working population. We sponsor schools, fund the hospital, support local infrastructure. Our relationship with this town is symbiotic, and Dr. Brennan threatened that relationship. Dr. Brennan was a talented scientist who suffered from paranoid delusions exacerbated by substance abuse. It's tragic, truly, but her allegations were thoroughly investigated and found to be baseless by a firm that later went out of business for falsifying reports. Crow's smile didn't waver, but something cooled in his eyes. I see you've done your homework. Harrison Environmental had issues, yes, but their conclusions were independently verified by state regulators. Before or after the evidence went missing. Mr. Ashford, I'm not here to relitigate the past. I'm here to discuss your future. He leaned forward slightly. You bought 50 acres of land that frankly you overpaid for. The Whitaker property has been on the market for decades because it's essentially worthless too, remote for development, too contaminated for agriculture. Contaminated, poor word choice. Let's say environmentally challenged. Natural mineral deposits that make the water table unsuitable for wells. Soil composition that won't support crops. You understand? What I understand is that you're very interested in land I just bought. We're interested in preventing you from making costly mistakes. If you were to start, say, digging foundations or drilling wells, you might encounter issues that would be expensive to remediate. We'd hate to see you waste resources on a property that will never be what you hope. What exactly are you offering? Valdchem would be willing to purchase your property for 20% above what you paid. Clean transaction, cash settlement, no questions asked. You walk away with a profit and avoid future headaches. Garrett studied the man across from him. Everything about Crow was calibrated: the tone, the posture, the carefully worded threats disguised as helpful advice. This was someone who'd spent decades managing problems and who'd learned that money usually worked better than muscle. And if I'm not interested in selling, then I'd strongly encourage you to be very careful about what you do on that land. Environmental regulations are complex. Permits can be difficult to obtain. And if you were to start making public allegations based on, say, old documents of questionable provenance, well, defamation lawsuits can be ruinous. There it was. The velvet glove removed just enough to show the iron fist beneath. I appreciate your concern, Garrett said, standing, but I think I'll hold on to my property. Mr. Ashford, we're done. He walked out before Crow could respond, aware of the man's eyes following him all the way to the door. In the truck, Kodiak sat at attention, having watched the entire exchange through the coffee shop window. The dog's posture communicated clear assessment, threat identified position, maintained awaiting orders. Yeah, Garrett said, I don't like him either. They drove back toward the mountain, but halfway there, Garrett pulled off onto a logging road he'd noticed earlier. He needed to think, needed to process what he'd learned, needed to decide what came next. The logging road ended at a clearing that gave a view of the valley below. Pine Ridge spread out in miniature the main street, with its struggling businesses. The Vald Chem plant on the eastern edge, the residential areas where people lived their lives unaware of the poison beneath their feet. Garrett had spent 15 years learning to assess tactical situations, mission parameters, risk versus reward, acceptable casualties. The problem was he'd learned those lessons too well. In 2019, he'd calculated that the intelligence was solid, that the target building held only enemy combatants, that the acceptable risk was acceptable. He'd been wrong. And 3 men died because he trusted the system, followed the parameters, believed that someone higher up the chain had done the math correctly. Now he was being asked to do math again. Weigh his responsibility against the potential cost. Consider that maybe the polite corporate man was right. Maybe stirring up the past would hurt more people than it helped. Maybe the contamination was old enough that it didn't matter anymore. Maybe the economic stability of a town was worth more than abstract justice. Maybe silence was the responsible choice. His phone buzzed, text message from a number he didn't recognize. Radio just reported missing child. 9-year-old boy last seen near the old Forest Service road. That's your property. Thought you should know. Lorelei Garrett's chest tightened. He opened the truck's glove compartment and pulled out a topographical map of his land, spreading it across the steering wheel. The old Forest Service road ran along his eastern boundary, right through the area Dr. Brennan had marked as heavily contaminated. He looked at Kodiak. You up for a search? The dog's ears came forward, body tensing with purpose. This was what he'd been trained for. This was what he understood. They got out of the truck, and Garrett pulled Kodiak's tactical vest from the back, the one with the handle on top for control, the one that signaled to the dog that they were working. Kodiak stood perfectly still as Garrett fitted it, then looked up with eyes that said, "Give the order." "Find," Garrett commanded, and they moved into the forest. Kodiak worked methodically, nose down, moving in expanding spirals from the logging road. This was search and rescue, not combat tracking, but the fundamentals were the same. Use the dog's superior senses, trust his instincts, follow where he led. The forest grew denser as they moved east. The ground became rougher, scattered with deadfall and outcroppings of rock that made walking treacherous. Garrett kept his eyes on Kodiak, reading the dog's body language, like text. 20 minutes and Kodiak's posture changed. His head came up, ears locked forward, body going rigid in the alert that meant target acquired. He moved faster now, with purpose, leading Garrett down a slope toward what looked like an old creek bed. The dog stopped at the edge of a depression, partially hidden by fallen trees, and Garrett heard it, a child crying, weak but alive. The boy was maybe 9 years old, curled against the roots of an enormous fir tree, his leg bent at an angle that made Garrett's stomach clench. Finn Holloway, according to Lorelei's text. His face was pale, tracked with tears and dirt. "Finn, my name's Garrett. I'm here to help." The boy's eyes were unfocused, shock setting in. "My leg hurts." "I know, buddy. We're going to get you out of here." Garrett keyed his phone, grateful for the weak signal. "I need an ambulance at the old Forest Service Road eastern section. Child with possible fracture, signs of shock." He pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the boy, then carefully assessed the injury. Broken tibia, probably. Not life-threatening, but serious enough. Kodiak sat nearby, watching with the calm intensity of a professional who'd done his job and was now providing security. "That's a cool dog," Finn whispered. "Yeah, he's the one who found you." "What's his name?" "Kodiak." "Like the bear." "Exactly like the bear." The boy managed a weak smile, then his eyes began to close. "I'm cold." "Stay awake, Finn. Talk to me. What were you doing out here?" "Exploring. Mom said not to, but—" His voice trailed off. "But you did anyway. I get it. I was 9 once too." They waited together, Garrett keeping the boy talking, monitoring his vitals, fighting down the familiar terror of watching someone vulnerable slip away. This was different from combat. This was a child who'd made a mistake, who deserved to be rescued, who represented everything Garrett had once believed he was protecting. The ambulance arrived 15 minutes later, paramedics moving with practiced efficiency. They stabilized Finn's leg, got him on a stretcher, started an IV line. "You saved his life," one of the paramedics said to Garrett. "Another hour out here and hypothermia would have killed him. The dog found him. I just followed." They loaded Finn into the ambulance. The boy's mother, Bryn Holloway, arrived just as they were closing the doors, her face white with terror and relief. She grabbed Garrett's arm. "Thank you. God, thank you. He's going to be fine." She looked at Kodiak, who sat at attention beside Garrett. "That dog, they said he's the one who tracked my son." "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes filled with tears. "I work for Valdchem. On the books, I'm supposed to discourage people from going near company property. But between you and me, she lowered her voice, that forest has been making people sick for years. Wildlife won't go there, plants don't grow right, and we're not supposed to talk about it. Why do you stay? Because I have a son to feed and Valdkem owns this town. She climbed into the ambulance with Finn. But maybe that needs to change. The ambulance pulled away, sirens fading into the distance. Garrett stood in the clearing with Kodiak watching the sun sink toward the mountains. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Lorelei. Heard you found the Holloway boy. The whole town's talking. You're a hero. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd stumbled into something larger than he'd expected, who'd made a decision without fully understanding the consequences, who was now responsible for things he couldn't walk away from. Back at camp as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Garrett built a fire and sat staring into the flames. Kodiak lay beside him, close enough for warmth, maintaining the professional distance that defined their relationship. I was planning to leave, Garrett said quietly. Buy the land, build a cabin, disappear. No more missions, no more decisions that get people killed. Kodiak's ear twitched. But now there's a rail car full of evidence, and a town living on poisoned ground, and a kid who nearly died because nobody wants to admit the truth. He looked at the dog. What would you do? Kodiak stared back with eyes that reflected firelight and offered no answers. Only the steady presence of a partner who'd made his own choice years ago to stand and fight rather than run. The wind picked up, scattering sparks into the darkness. Garrett pulled Dr. Brennan's journal from his pack and read again the final entry. If you're reading this, they've already won. But at least now you know I wasn't crazy. Except they hadn't won, not entirely. The rail car existed, the truth existed, and now someone knew. Garrett made his decision. Tomorrow he'd find a way to get those soil samples independently tested. Tomorrow he'd start documenting everything. Tomorrow he'd do what Dr. Brennan had died trying to do, force the truth into the light. He looked at Kodiak. We're not leaving, are we? The dog didn't move, didn't react, but something in his posture seemed to settle the subtle shift of a soldier accepting mission parameters. Yeah, Garrett said, that's what I thought. In the distance, an owl called. The fire crackled. And somewhere in the darkness, buried beneath decades of lies and convenient forgetting, the truth waited to be found. The call came at 2 a.m. Garrett woke to his phone vibrating against the tent floor. Kodiak already alert at the entrance, ears forward in the darkness. The number was Silas Merrick's. Ashford. They're moving. Merrick's voice was tight, controlled panic barely held in check. I've been monitoring the Valdkem frequencies, old habit from my reporting days. They've got crews mobilizing. Heavy equipment. They're going after the rail car. Garrett was already pulling on his boots. When shall them? Now, maybe an hour out. They're calling it emergency site remediation, but that's corporate speak for destroying evidence. A pause. If you're going to do something, it has to be tonight. I need those soil samples verified. Do you know anyone? Dr. Rachel Voss, independent environmental consultant out of Portland. I already called her. She can be here by dawn if you can get her samples that aren't contaminated by Valdkem's people. Text me her number. Garrett killed the connection and looked at Kodiak. The dog was already on his feet, reading the urgency in his handler's movements with the precision of 6 years' partnership. We've got work to do. The forest at night was a different creature than in daylight. The moon 3/4 full cast everything in silver and shadow. Garrett moved with the tactical awareness of 15 years training, Kodiak ranging ahead in disciplined sweeps, both of them ghosts in the darkness. They reached the rail car in 18 minutes. No sign of Valdkem crews yet, but Garrett could hear the distant rumble of heavy machinery echoing through the valley. He had maybe 30 minutes. Inside the rail car, working by flashlight, Garrett collected what he needed: soil samples from the containers. Dr. Brennan had stored water samples from sealed vials, documents that looked most damning. He stuffed everything into a waterproof bag, then hesitated. The journal. Dr. Brennan's handwritten account. The most damaging evidence and the most human. He took it. But as he turned to leave, his flashlight caught something else, a metal box he'd missed on the first search, tucked behind a collapsed filing cabinet. Inside, a cassette tape in a plastic case labeled in handwriting he recognized from old family photos. For Garrett, if you're the one who finds this, then I failed. Don't make my mistakes. Boone, his brother's handwriting. His brother's voice preserved on magnetic tape, waiting 38 years to be heard. Garrett pocketed the cassette and moved to the door. Kodiak barked once, sharp, urgent. The warning bark that meant contact imminent. Garrett killed his flashlight and moved to the railcar's door. Through the trees, he could see lights now. Multiple vehicles moving slowly up what must have been an old service road he hadn't known existed. Valdkem had maps he didn't access to land records that showed routes long abandoned. They were coming. He slipped out of the rail car and into the forest, Kodiak at his heel, moving fast but controlled. Behind them, the sound of diesel engines grew louder. Voices carried through the trees, men coordinating machinery positioning. Garrett made it 200 yards before he heard the first explosion. Not large, controlled, professional. The sound of shape charges used to collapse structures. He turned in time to see fire blooming in the darkness, where the railcar had been orange light painting the forest canopy. They were burning the evidence. Kodiak growled low in his chest the first time Garrett had heard that sound in months. The dog understood destruction, understood the enemy's intent. Easy, Garrett said quietly. We got what we needed. They made it back to camp as the eastern sky began to gray. Garrett's phone showed 3 missed calls from Merrick and a text with Dr. Voss's contact information. He called her. Dr. Voss, Garrett Ashford, Silas Merrick said you could help me. He said you have samples from the Pine Ridge contamination site. Her voice was crisp, professional. The one Valdchem spent 40 years denying exists. I have soil samples, water samples, and documentation from 1986. Can you verify them? I can do better than verify. I can provide independent analysis that will hold up in federal court. But Mr. Ashford, you need to understand, once we start this process, Valdchem will come after you with everything they have. They already burned the primary evidence site tonight. A pause. Then we better move fast. I'm 2 hours out. Meet me at the Pine Ridge Medical Center parking lot at 6 a.m. And Mr. Ashford, don't tell anyone else. If Valdchem knows you have samples, they'll find a way to make them disappear. The Pine Ridge Medical Center was a low brick building that served 3 counties and always looked slightly overwhelmed. Garrett arrived at 5:45, Kodiak alert in the passenger seat, both of them running on adrenaline and coffee. Dr. Rachel Voss pulled up at 5:58 in a Subaru Outback with Portland plates. She was younger than Garrett expected, mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of competent energy that came from knowing exactly what you were doing. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. You have the samples. Garrett handed over the waterproof bag. She opened it in her trunk, the contents with systematic precision. These seals are original, she said, from the mid-'80s based on the container design. If the chain of custody holds up, this is gold. She looked at Garrett. Where did you find these? Railcar hidden on my property. A scientist named Dr. Catherine Brennan stored them there. Voss's expression shifted recognition and something deeper. I know that name. She was brilliant. Did environmental work for the state before going private. Then she died and everyone said she was crazy. She wasn't crazy. She was right. Then let's prove it. Voss loaded the samples into a cooler. I'll have preliminary results in 48 hours. Full analysis in a week. But Mr. Ashford, you need to be prepared for what comes next. If these samples show what I think they'll show, Valdchem won't just fight back. They'll destroy you. Let them try. She studied him for a moment. You're military, aren't you? Was. Good. You're going to need that training. She climbed into her Subaru. Watch your back. These people play for keeps. Garrett returned to camp to find Sheriff Ridgway's cruiser parked beside his tent. The older man sat on the tailgate of Garrett's truck drinking coffee from a thermos, while Kodiak maintained a professional distance, not aggressive, but not welcoming either. Your dog doesn't like cops much, Ridgway said. He doesn't like most people. Smart dog. The sheriff gestured to the forest. Heard Valdchem ran some kind of emergency operation on your property last night. Heavy equipment controlled burns. You know anything about that? They destroyed a rail car, one that contained evidence of illegal dumping. Ridgway was quiet for a long moment. You got proof? I did. Now I have samples and documentation. The rail car itself is gone. Convenient for them. The sheriff stood, his expression unreadable. Mr. Ashford, I've been sheriff here for 23 years. I know things about this town that I wish I didn't. I know Valdchem cuts corners and buries mistakes. I know people get sick in certain areas and we're not supposed to ask why. I know that good people who ask too many questions end up leaving town or having accidents. And you've done nothing. I've done what I could without getting my deputies killed or my department defunded. Ridgway met his eyes. But if you've got real evidence proof that would hold up outside this county, outside Valdchem's sphere of influence, then maybe things can change. You'll help. I'll do what I'm allowed to do well, which isn't much, but I can make sure you don't mysteriously have car accidents or equipment failures. He poured the rest of his coffee onto the ground. There's a storm coming in tonight, big one. Forest Service is worried about wildfire risk. Lightning strikes, high winds, dry conditions despite the rain. If I were you, I'd make sure my camp was secure. Appreciate the warning. Ridgway paused at his cruiser door. That boy you saved yesterday, Finn Holloway. His blood work came back from the hospital. Elevated levels of heavy metals, chromium lead arsenic. The kind of exposure that doesn't happen from playing in normal dirt. Does his mother know? Not yet. Hospital's waiting on a secondary confirmation before releasing the results. But between you and me, that kid's been playing on poisoned ground his whole life, and nobody told his mother it wasn't safe. The sheriff's jaw tightened. That's on me as much as anyone. I let it happen because it was easier than fighting. He drove away, leaving Garrett standing in the morning light with a tea and questions that were getting heavier by the hour. Garrett spent the afternoon securing camp and thinking about the cassette tape in his pocket. His brother's voice preserved in waiting. Part of him didn't want to hear it, didn't want to know what Boone had been carrying all those years. But another part understood that some truths couldn't be avoided forever. He found an old cassette player in his truck's emergency kit, something he'd kept from his father's belongings, a relic of an earlier time. He loaded the tape and pressed play. Static. Then his brother's voice, older than Garrett remembered, but unmistakably Boone's. Garrett, if you're hearing this, then I'm dead, and you found what Dr. Brennan hid. I need you to understand something. I worked for Valdchem from 1982 to 1985. Chemical engineer. Good job, good pay, good future. And I helped them bury their mistakes. A long pause, breathing audible on the tape. Dr. Brennan came to audit the facility in 1985. She found what I'd been trying not to see: the illegal, dumping the falsified reports, the contamination that was going to poison people for generations. She documented everything. And when she tried to go public, they destroyed her, made her look crazy, threatened her. And when that wasn't enough, they killed her and made it look like suicide. I knew. God help me, I knew, and I was too afraid to speak up. They threatened our family, threatened you specifically. Said if I talked, they'd make sure your Navy career ended before it started. So I kept quiet. I left Valdchem, joined the Navy, tried to make up for my cowardice by serving something bigger than myself. But guilt doesn't die, little brother. It just grows. In 1987, I leaked information to the EPA anonymously, got them to investigate the Clearwater Estates development. It was the least I could do. The contamination report stopped the project, but Valdchem buried the evidence and moved on like nothing happened. I've spent 30 years trying to gather enough proof to finish what Dr. Brennan started. But they're watching me. I know it. I can feel it. So I'm making this recording and hiding it where only someone who cares would look. If you're hearing this, then they got me. And it's your turn to decide, do you walk away like I did the first time, or do you stand and fight like Dr. Brennan did? I hope you fight. Because silence isn't neutral, Garrett. It's a choice, and it's the wrong one. Don't make my mistakes. Don't let them bury the truth again. Your brother Boone, March 2018. The tape clicked off. Garrett sat in the silence that followed his chest tight with a grief he'd been carrying for 7 years without understanding its full weight. Boone hadn't died in a simple training accident. He'd been murdered for trying to finish Dr. Brennan's work. And now that mission fell to Garrett. He found Silas Merrick at home, the older man working on his laptop, surrounded by papers and old photographs. My brother, Garrett said without preamble. Boone Ashford. How did he really die? Merrick looked up, something shifting behind his eyes, recognition maybe, or relief that the question had finally been asked. Sit down, he said. Garrett sat. I kept digging after you found the railcar, Merrick began. Your brother's name kept appearing in connection with Dr. Brennan's investigation. Not publicly, but in my notes and documents that didn't quite add up. Boone left the Navy in 2018, took a job with an environmental remediation firm. 3 months later, he contacted me. Said he had information about Valdchem, about Dr. Brennan's death, about a cover-up that went back decades. We were supposed to meet, but he died 2 days before our meeting. Single vehicle accident on County Road 9 near the old Morrison Bridge. Sheriff ruled it mechanical, failure brake line ruptured. Merrick pulled out a file folder, handed it to Garrett. Except the mechanic who'd serviced that truck a week earlier swore the brakes were perfect. I interviewed him. He was scared, as said someone had been asking questions about Boone's vehicle maintenance. He lost his business 6 months later. Moved to Idaho, wouldn't return my calls. Garrett opened the folder. Accident reports, photographs of twisted metal, a toxicology report showing Boone had been sober and alert when he died. No evidence of driver error, just a convenient mechanical failure that couldn't be proven or disproven. Crow, Garrett said quietly, can't prove it. But yes, probably Crow or someone working for him. Merrick leaned back. Your brother was trying to finish what Dr. Brennan started. He was the one who leaked the information to the EPA in 1987. I confirmed it through a source who's since passed. He's why Clearwater Estates never got built, and Valdchem figured it out eventually. How long have you known? Suspected for 7 years. Knew for certain about 3 weeks ago after you showed me those documents from the railcar. The handwriting on some of the annotations matched letters I'd received from an anonymous source in the late 80s. Your brother had been fighting this battle for 30 years, quietly, carefully, until they caught him. Garrett stared at the accident photos, seeing his brother's sacrifice in new light. Boone hadn't been a coward who'd run from the fight. He'd been a soldier who'd stayed in the war long after everyone else had forgotten there was a war to fight. He left a cassette for you, Merrick said. Gave it to me in 2018, said if anything happened to him and someone named Garrett Ashford came looking for answers, I should make sure you got him it. That's why I knew to trust you when you showed up asking about Dr. Brennan. Garrett looked at Kodiak, who sat watching him with dark, patient eyes. The dog had never met Boone, but somehow Garrett felt his brother's presence in this moment, the older operator passing the mission to the younger, trusting him to finish what he'd started. Then we finish it, Garrett said. For Dr. Brennan, for Boone, for everyone, Valdchem silenced. The storm rolled in just after noon. Garrett had seen weather systems in the Hindu Kush, had worked through typhoons in the Pacific, had learned to read the sky like a tactical map. This storm was different, born from the meeting of warm ocean air and cold mountain currents carrying enough electrical potential to make the hair on his arms stand up even hours before the first drops fell. The wind came first, bending the pines like grass, sending deadfall crashing through the understory. Then the rain-fat drops that hit like thrown stones, turning the forest floor to mud in minutes. Lightning split the sky, not the distant flicker of summer storms, but close, immediate, the kind that made targets of tall trees and anything metallic. Garrett secured the camp as best he could, moving supplies into the truck, reinforcing the tent with additional stakes. Kodiak worked beside him, disciplined and efficient, both of them operating with the practiced coordination of a team that had weathered worse. By 3 p.m., the storm had achieved something almost biblical in its intensity. Thunder rolled through the valley like artillery fire. Lightning struck close enough that Garrett could smell, Ozone could feel the electrical charge crackling across his skin. And then through the rain and chaos, his phone rang. Silas Merrick shouting over background noise. The railcar site is on fire. Lightning strikes set off whatever accelerant they used in the burn. It's spreading toward town. Garrett's chest went cold. How bad? Forest Service says it could take out the western residential area if the wind shifts. They're mobilizing for evacuation, but half their equipment is committed to a fire in the next county. We don't have enough people. I'm on my way. He didn't think, didn't calculate. Just moved Kodiak launching into the truck before Garrett had the door fully open. Both of them understanding that when fire came, you fought or you died. The drive down the mountain was controlled chaos. The road slick with rain and debris visibility measured in yards rather than miles. Other vehicles moved past going the opposite direction, families evacuating, taking what they could carry and abandoning the rest. Garrett drove toward the smoke. The firehead crown jumped from the ground into the canopy where it could run faster than a man could sprint. Through the rain and smoke, Garrett could see the orange glow spreading, carried by wind that seemed determined to push the flames directly into Pine Ridge's western neighborhoods. He found Silas Merrick at the makeshift command post in the high school parking lot, coordinating volunteers with the efficiency of someone who'd covered enough disasters to know what mattered. What do you need? Garrett asked. Spotters, people who know the forest and can identify structures in the evacuation zone. Merrick handed him a radio and a map marked with color-coded zones. Red areas are definitely compromised. Yellow areas are at risk. We need to make sure everyone's out. Kodiak's trained for search and rescue. Merrick's expression shifted hope and calculation. Then get to the yellow zone. Make sure no one's left behind. Garrett took the map and the radio. He was turning to leave when a hand grabbed his arm. Bryn Holloway stood there, her face streaked with ash and rain, her eyes fierce with determination. I know where they're taking the evidence. What? Crow. Before he left town this morning, he moved files, physical documents, from the old Valdchem office. I saw the boxes when I went to get my final paycheck. I helped load them 3 days ago. Her voice shook. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought it was routine corporate relocation, but those documents, internal memos, contamination reports, correspondence about Dr. Brennan if they disappear. Where are they? Corporate storage facility 20 miles south on Highway 22. Climate-controlled unit, high security. But Crow left someone guarding them until they can be disposed of properly. She pulled a key card from her pocket. This will get you past the main gate. I'm done protecting people who poisoned my son. Garrett looked at the key card, then at the fire consuming the forest, then back at Bryn. This was the choice: chase the evidence or save lives. There wasn't really a choice at all. Give that to Sheriff Ridgway, Garrett said, pressing the card back into her hand. Tell him to raid the storage facility now before Crow's people can destroy what's there. I've got people to save. You're sure that evidence can be recreated, lives can't? He ran for his truck. The yellow zone was a nightmare of smoke and confusion. Garrett worked systematically, checking houses, marked on the map, calling out, looking for signs of occupation. Most were empty. People had heeded the evacuation order. But in a ranch house at the end of a gravel drive, he found an elderly couple trying to load a lifetime of possessions into a sedan too small to hold their memories. You need to leave now, Garrett said. Not in 10 minutes. Now. Our photos, the woman said, tears streaming. 60 years of memories. I can't leave them. Garrett grabbed 2 albums at random. These, nothing else. Go. They went. 4 houses later, Kodiak froze the alert posture that meant human scent detected. The dog moved with purpose toward a mobile home with dark windows and no vehicle in the drive. Garrett tried the door. Locked. He broke a window and climbed through. Inside, he found Lorelei from the diner sitting on her living room floor, surrounded by photo albums and handwritten letters, tears tracking through the ash on her face. I can't leave it, she said. This was Tom's house. My husband. He built it with his own hands. Every board, every nail. I can't just abandon it. Lorelei, the fire's coming. We have maybe 5 minutes. Then let it come. I'm tired, Garrett. Tired of running. Tired of losing things. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much loss. What's one more? Oh. Garrett understood. God, he understood. The impulse to stand and fight even when fighting was futile. The need to make a line somewhere and say no further. But he also understood that dying for a symbol accomplished nothing. Your husband wouldn't want you to burn, Garrett said quietly. He'd want you to live, to remember him, to keep his story alive. He held out his hand. Come with me, please. She looked at him for a long moment, then took his hand. They made it to the truck as the fire crested the ridge. Garrett drove fast, pushing the limits of traction and visibility. Kodiak braced in the back seat, and Lorelei clutching a single photo album in her lap. They were halfway to the main road when Kodiak barked, urgent, insistent. The dog was staring back toward the fire body, tense, every muscle communicating. Something's wrong. Garrett stopped the truck. What is it? Kodiak jumped out before Garrett could stop him, running back toward the flames with the kind of focused intensity that meant he'd detected something critical. Kodiak, stand down. The dog didn't stop, didn't slow, just disappeared into the smoke with the absolute certainty of a K9 who'd made his decision. Garrett turned to Lorelei. Drive to the school. Tell Merrick what happened. You can't go back there. But Garrett was already running, following his dog into the fire. The smoke was thick enough to choke on, hot enough to sear his lungs with every breath. Garrett pulled his shirt over his mouth and moved by instinct and training, tracking Kodiak's path by broken undergrowth and the occasional bark that pierced the roar of flames. He found them in a clearing 200 yards from the road. Silas Merrick lay pinned under a fallen tree, his leg bent at an impossible angle, his face gray with shock. And standing over him, refusing to leave, was Kodiak Hackle's raised body position between the fallen man and the advancing fire. Can't move it, Merrick gasped. Told the dog to go. Stubborn bastard won't listen. Garrett assessed the situation with combat efficiency. The tree was massive Douglas fir, probably 2 feet in diameter. Not something he could lift alone. But the way it had fallen, one end propped up by a boulder, created a lever point. He found a branch strong enough to serve as a pry bar, wedged it under the tree, and put his full weight into the effort. The tree shifted an inch, 2 inches. Kodiak, pull. The dog understood, grabbed Merrick's jacket in his teeth, and dragged backward with all 70 pounds of trained muscle. The tree shifted more. Garrett felt something tear in his shoulder. Old injury from an operation 3 years gone, but he kept pushing, kept leveraging, kept fighting against physics and time and the fire that wanted to consume them all. Merrick came free. Go, Garrett shouted, supporting the older man's weight. Move. They made it 20 yards before the tree Garrett had been using as a lever exploded from the heat sap boiling, wood splitting with sounds like gunfire, the whole thing becoming shrapnel and flame. Something hit Kodiak. The dog went down with a single sharp yelp, pain and surprise, then silence. Professional silence. The kind of discipline that said, I'm hurt, but still functional. but he wasn't moving his left hind leg. Garrett's vision went red around the edges. Not again. Not this dog. Not after everything. He hoisted Merrick over his shoulder and a fireman's carry ignored the older man's protests and turned to Kodiak. The dog tried to stand, got 3 legs under himself, but the 4th hung useless. "I'm not leaving you," Garrett said. He bent and scooped the 70-pound German shepherd into his arms, awkward, unbalanced, probably impossible. Kodiak's eyes met his, dark and trusting, and absolutely certain that his handler would not fail him. Garrett ran, 180 pounds of combined weight. Smoke thick enough to drown in, heat intense enough to blister exposed skin. The terrain rough and getting rougher. He fell twice, got up twice, kept moving because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing, and he'd failed enough for one lifetime. His lungs were failing, his vision tunneling, his shoulder screaming. But ahead through the smoke, he could see lights, emergency vehicles, the high school parking lot safety. 50 yards, 30, 10, hands reached for him. Paramedics took Merrick. Someone tried to take Kodiak, but Garrett held on until he was certain, absolutely certain, that the dog was going to a veterinarian, not just being set aside. "The vet clinic," he gasped. "Pine Ridge Animal Hospital. Take him there. Tell them to save that leg, whatever it costs." A paramedic, young, competent, nodded. "We've got him. You need oxygen." "I'm fine." He wasn't fine. He was half dead from smoke inhalation, and his shoulder was definitely dislocated, and he'd probably taken years off his life running through fire with 2 lives in his arms. But Kodiak was alive. Merrick was alive, and that would have to be enough. They took the dog away in a separate ambulance, and Garrett had to physically restrain himself from following. Instead, he let the paramedics treat him, oxygen mask, IV fluids, preliminary assessment, while he watched the fire in the distance. The rain intensified around midnight, and what the firefighters couldn't stop, nature did. The flames sputtered and died, leaving behind a charred scar across the landscape, but sparing the town itself. Sheriff Ridgway found Garrett in the high school gymnasium, where evacuees had gathered, families reuniting and counting their blessings. "Your dog's in surgery," Ridgway said, handing him coffee. "Vet says the leg's savable, but it'll be a long recovery." "He saved Merrick's life." "Merrick says you saved both their lives." Ridgway sat down heavily. "Also says you let evidence slip away to save people." "That true, Bram. Bryn gave you the key card. We hit the storage facility an hour ago, found 3 decades of internal memos, contamination reports. Veldkem thought they destroyed correspondence between Crow and the medical examiner, who signed Dr. Brennan's death certificate, even documents related to your brother's accident investigation." The sheriff smiled grimly. "That evidence, combined with Dr. Voss's soil samples, is ironclad. Federal prosecutors are already drawing up indictments." Garrett closed his eyes, relief washing over him like a physical force. The choice had been right. Lives first, evidence second. And somehow, miraculously, they'd gotten both. "There's more," Ridgway continued. "Crow tried to flee the country. TSA flagged him at Purin and at Portland International. He's in federal custody now, and apparently he's very interested in making a deal. Started talking the minute they put him in handcuffs. Names, dates, payoffs, everything. Wants to trade testimony for a reduced sentence. Will they give it to him? Probably. But even with a deal, he's looking at serious time. And Valdchem Industries is finished. Parent company's already filing bankruptcy to avoid the cleanup costs and civil suits." They sat in silence, watching families embrace, listening to children who didn't understand how close they'd come to losing everything. "You did good work here," Ridgway said finally. "Messy, dangerous, probably not by the book, but good. Just finished what other people started." "No, you finished what other people died trying to start. There's a difference." Morning came gray and exhausted, the fire reduced to smoking ruins and the smell of char that would linger for weeks. Garrett stood in the parking lot watching the sun struggle through smoke-stained clouds when Dr. Voss called. "Preliminary results are back," she said without preamble. "Mr. Ashford, these samples show contamination levels that are, I don't have adequate words. Hexavalent chromium at concentrations that would require immediate Superfund designation. Heavy metals throughout the soil profile at depths suggesting decades of continuous dumping. Organic compounds I can't even identify without additional mass spectrometry. How bad? This site should have been evacuated and remediated 40 years ago. Every year people lived here, worked here, raised children here. They were being poisoned. The elevated cancer rates, the developmental disorders, the mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't explain, all completely consistent with chronic heavy metal and chemical exposure. Can you testify to that? I can and I will. I'm sending the full report to the EPA, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and every major news outlet I can think of. I'm also copying the CDC and ATSDR because this represents a public health catastrophe that's been ongoing for nearly 4 decades. Her voice hardened with professional anger. This doesn't stay buried anymore, Mr. Ashford. Not on my watch. The call ended and Garrett felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying since finding that rail car. Maybe since his brother died, maybe since he'd given that fatal order in 2019 and learned that some mistakes couldn't be undone. But this one could. This wrong could be made right. Not perfectly, not without cost, but right enough that the people who'd been silenced would finally be heard. He found Silas Merrick being wheeled out of the medical center. 12 hours later, his leg in a cast, his face exhausted, but carrying something Garrett recognized: the satisfaction of a mission completed against impossible odds. Crow's gone, Merrick said without preamble. Left town this morning in federal custody. Resigned from Valchem, waived his rights, started cooperating immediately. Apparently facing 30 years in federal prison has a way of loosening tongues. He'll get a deal. Probably, but even with cooperation, he's admitting to conspiracy, obstruction of justice, possibly accessory to murder, if they can prove he ordered the hits on Dr. Brennan and your brother. Merrick's expression was grim satisfaction. Smart rats leave sinking ships. But this rat's still going in a cage, just a smaller one. What about Valchem? Parent company announced bankruptcy this morning. They're trying to shield assets, but the EPA is already moving for Superfund designation, which means they won't be able to dodge cleanup costs. Civil suits are piling up: wrongful death claims, medical expenses, property devaluation. They're done. And the town, scared, angry, confused. Merrick shifted in his wheelchair. 150 families are being relocated while the EPA does soil testing. The contamination zone is bigger than anyone thought, covers most of the western residential area and parts of downtown. We're looking at a 20-year remediation project minimum. Jobs. Valdchem employed 200 people directly, another 100 through contractors and suppliers. That's gone now. But there's already talk of federal disaster relief, PA jobs for the cleanup, even some interest from green energy companies looking to redevelop the old industrial site. A pause. It'll be rough for a few years, but we'll survive. We were dying slowly anyway from poison disguised as prosperity. At least now we've got a chance at something real. Garrett looked toward the mountains where his 50 acres sat at the center of what would soon be designated the Pine Ridge Superfund site. The land he'd bought for peace and solitude had become the epicenter of revelation and change. Your property's going to be part of the remediation zone, Merrick said, following his gaze. EPA's already contacted the county about access. You won't be able to live there during cleanup. I know. But after 10-15 years, it could be usable again. Not for farming or residential, but for something. Garrett thought about that. Thought about what could rise from contaminated ground once the poison was drawn out. Thought about second chances and redemption and the long, patient work of healing. Yeah, he said, for something. The Pine Ridge Animal Hospital was a small brick building that smelled of antiseptic and dog food, and the particular kindness of people who'd chosen to spend their lives helping creatures who couldn't speak their pain. The veterinarian found Garrett in the waiting room at noon, still wearing surgical scrubs, fatigue evident in every line of her face. The surgery went well, she said. We pinned the fracture, repaired the soft tissue damage, treated for smoke inhalation and minor burns. Barring complications, he should make a full recovery, though he'll always have a slight limp. Can I see him? He's still groggy from anesthesia, but yes. Kodiak lay in a recovery kennel, his left hind leg wrapped in bandages, and splinted an IV line in his foreleg, delivering fluids and pain medication. His eyes were half open, unfocused, but they tracked Garrett's movement as he knelt beside the kennel. Hey, partner. The dog's tail moved once, not a wag, but acknowledgement. Even drugged and injured, Kodiak maintained his professional composure. Garrett put his hand against the kennel door, and Kodiak shifted slightly, resting his muzzle near Garrett's fingers. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of 6 years' partnership and trust that ran deeper than words. You stubborn bastard, Garrett said quietly. Why couldn't you just leave him? Because that's not what partners did. Because loyalty didn't calculate odds or assess acceptable losses. Because some decisions were made with the heart instead of the head, and sometimes those were the right decisions even when they costed everything. The vet put her hand on Garrett's shoulder. He'll need extensive rehabilitation, physical therapy, controlled exercise, probably 6 months before he's fully mobile, and he'll never be cleared for active duty again. That's fine, we're both retired, she smiled. Then I'd say he earned his rest. That dog saved a man's life yesterday. That's more than most of us manage in a lifetime. Garrett stayed until Kodiak fell back asleep, then drove to Lorelei's diner, or what had been her diner before the fire took her home and left her with nothing but a photo album and the clothes she'd been wearing. He found her at a table in the high school cafeteria serving coffee to evacuees with the same efficient grace she'd shown in her own establishment. When she saw Garrett, something in her face cracked exhaustion and grief and gratitude, mixing into an expression too complex for words. "Your dog," she asked. "Going to be fine. Long recovery, but fine." "Good." She poured him coffee without asking. "That animal's got more sense than most people I know." He gets that a lot. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who'd lost things but survived, who understood that survival itself was sometimes the victory. "I'm leaving Pine Ridge," Lorelei said finally. "My sister's in Bend. She's got room. Says I can work in her restaurant until I figure out what's next." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I've been here 40 years, and I never left because Tom was here, his memory, his house, his dreams. But that's all gone now. Maybe it's time I found out who I am without all that history weighing me down." She met his eyes. "What about you?" "Don't know yet. Can't live on my land during the cleanup. But I'm not ready to leave either. Too much unfinished." "Then stay. Find a rental. Keep fighting. The town needs people like you, people who don't calculate whether standing up is worth the cost. People who just stand because it's right." 8 months later, the Ashford Canine Sanctuary occupied a converted barn on rented land 3 miles outside Pine Ridge temporary quarters until the EPA finished remediating the original property. The main building housed kennels for 8 dogs at capacity, most of them retired military or police, K9s with nowhere else to go. A few were shelter rescues that showed aptitude and temperament for service work. Outside a fenced training area stretched across 2 acres, and beyond that, the Oregon wilderness continued its patient existence, indifferent to human drama. Garrett stood on the porch of the small cabin he'd built, rough lumber and determination. Nothing fancy but solid, watching Kodiak work with a younger German shepherd. The older dog's limp was barely noticeable now, 8 months of rehabilitation having restored most of his mobility. He moved with the same professional efficiency he had always shown, teaching the younger dog, through example, the way veteran operators always did. A car pulled up the drive. Bryn Holloway and Finn, who visited twice a week for what the doctors called animal-assisted therapy, and what Garrett called letting kids be kids around dogs that understand. Finn ran to Kodiak immediately, and the old canine tolerated the enthusiasm with patient dignity. The boy's heavy metal levels had dropped significantly after relocating to the eastern part of town outside the contamination zone. He'd need monitoring for years, but the prognosis was good. "He's doing so much better," Bryn said, watching her son laugh as Kodiak demonstrated proper ball retrieval technique. "The doctors say another year and his levels should be completely normal." "That's good. It's because of you. All of this." She gestured around the sanctuary, the town beyond the future that had opened up when the truth came to light. "You gave my son a chance at a normal life. Your son gave me a reason to stay." She smiled understanding, then pulled an envelope from her purse. "This came to the town hall. It's addressed to you." Garrett opened it. Inside, a letter on official letterhead from the Environmental Protection Agency and a check for $50,000. "Dear Mr. Ashford, in recognition of your instrumental role in exposing the Pine Ridge contamination site and providing critical evidence that led to the federal investigation of Valchem Industries, the EPA is pleased to award you compensation under the Whistleblower Protection Program. Additionally, the Dr. Catherine Brennan Memorial Fund, established by surviving family members, wishes to contribute to the K9 sanctuary you founded on the remediated property. Enclosed, please find their initial donation. Dr. Brennan would be proud to know her work was finished by someone who listened when a good dog said something was wrong. Sincerely, Regional Administrator, EPA Region 10. A second check fell out, another $50,000, this one from a private foundation bearing Dr. Brennan's name. Garrett stared at the numbers, thinking about everything they represented. Justice, maybe. Acknowledgement. The long-delayed recognition that some truths were worth fighting for. His phone buzzed. Text message from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Ashford, this is Captain Hayes, SEAL Team 3. Heard about what you did in Oregon. Heard about the sanctuary. We've got 3 K9s retiring this year. Who could use a place like yours? Interested?" Garrett typed back, "Send them, we've got room." Because that's what you did when you finally stopped running. You built something. You created space for the broken and the loyal, and the ones who'd fought too long without rest. The sanctuary's first official visitor arrived 2 weeks later, a retired Marine colonel evaluating the facility for a veterans charity grant. He arrived in dress uniform medals gleaming, expecting military precision. Garrett gave him the tour. The kennels were clean, the training equipment professional, the documentation thorough. Impressive, Mr. Ashford. I'd like to meet your lead trainer. Garrett whistled. Kodiak limped over the limp, truly barely noticeable now, and sat at perfect attention. The colonel bent down, extending his hand for Kodiak to sniff in the approved manner. Good boy. You're a fine example of... Kodiak's eyes went half-lidded in the canine equivalent of withering disdain. His head turned away slowly, deliberately, as if the colonel had just committed an unforgivable breach of protocol. The Marine straightened, bewildered. Did your dog just insult me? He doesn't like being called good boy, Garrett explained, keeping his expression neutral. He considers it patronizing. He prefers professional acknowledgement of competence. The colonel stared. Your dog has an ego problem. No, sir, he has standards. There's a difference. Kodiak stood and walked away with the measured dignity of someone who'd made his point and had better things to do. His slight limp somehow adding to, rather than detracting from, his air of professional superiority. The colonel watched him go, then started laughing, the kind of surprised, genuine laughter of someone who'd been humbled by a 70-pound German shepherd with a superiority complex. I like him, the colonel said, wiping his eyes. Approval granted. Any dog that knows his own worth deserves support. That's the kind of attitude we need more of. Yes, sir, that's the problem. 6 months after that, the sanctuary was operating at full capacity with 12 dogs and a waiting list. Garrett had hired 2 staff members, both veterans, both dealing with their own demons, both finding purpose in caring for animals who understood trauma without judgment. Silas Merrick visited weekly sometimes to volunteer, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk. His leg had healed, though he used a cane now, and walked with a pronounced limp that matched Kodiak's. We're a matched set, he joked, the limping survivors of Valdkem's last stand. The town was changing, slowly. The cleanup continued, massive excavators removing contaminated soil, specialized teams treating the water table, EPA monitors testing everything. Where Valdkem's YA plant had stood, a solar panel manufacturer was building a new facility, bringing jobs that didn't poison the people who worked them. Thaddeus Crowe had pled guilty to conspiracy and obstruction of justice. His testimony had led to 17 additional indictments, including the former CEO of Valdkem and the medical examiner who'd falsified Dr. Brennan's autopsy. He was serving 12 years in federal prison. The Pine Ridge Gazette, now under new ownership and editorial direction, had won a regional journalism award for Silas Merrick's investigative series on the contamination cover-up. Merrick had donated the prize money to the sanctuary, and on the remediated land where Dr. Catherine Brennan's railcar had once hidden the truth, the EPA had installed a memorial plaque, Dr. Catherine Brennan, 1945 to 1987, environmental scientist. She was right. The truth just took 40 years to catch up. Garrett stood before that plaque on a cold November morning, 2 years after finding the railcar, thinking about the chain of courage that had led here. Dr. Brennan, who'd documented the truth despite threats. His brother Boone, who'd fought quietly for 30 years to vindicate her. Silas Merrick, who'd never stopped believing. And Kodiak, who'd simply refused to walk past something that was wrong. The dog stood beside him, now older, but still professional, still alert, still the soldier he'd always been. We did it, Garrett said quietly. We finished what they started. Kodiak's tail moved once, not enthusiasm but acknowledgement. Mission complete. Standards maintained. Together they walked back to the sanctuary where a new arrival was waiting. A Belgian Malinois named Atlas retired after 8 years with Marine Special Operations, covered in scars and carrying the kind of 1,000-yard stare that Garrett recognized in mirrors. Welcome home, Garrett told the dog. Atlas looked at him, then at Kodiak, then at the mountains rising beyond the fence. Something in the dog's posture relaxed fractionally, the first sign that maybe eventually he might remember what it felt like to be safe. That night, as the sun set over the Cascades and painted the sky in colors that seemed impossible after so much darkness, Garrett sat on his porch with Kodiak at his side and thought about miracles. Not the flashy kind, not the dramatic interventions that changed everything in an instant, but the quiet kind, the subtle kind. The kind that came as a dog's refusal to keep walking, as a journalist's stubborn refusal to forget, as a brother's 30-year commitment to making one wrong thing right. The kind that came as the courage to stay when leaving would have been easier. Sometimes miracles didn't announce themselves with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they came as a gentle warning you almost missed, as a loyal friend who refused to let you quit. as the slow, patient work of people who chose truth over comfort and justice over silence. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they came as a second chance to get things right. Kodiak shifted position, settling more comfortably against Garrett's leg, the closest the dog ever came to overt affection. His eyes remained alert, scanning the darkening forest with a professional awareness that never quite turned off. But for the first time in 6 years of partnership, Garrett thought he detected something new in that vigilant gaze piece. Not the absence of readiness, not the surrender of discipline, but the calm that came from knowing the mission was complete, the objective achieved, the standard maintained. They'd stood their ground, they'd fought the fight, they'd finished what others had started, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough.